I just spent a week with the Toyota RAV4 PRIME, and for those of you that don't know, it's kind of halfway between like a Tesla and a normal RAV4. And after my week with it, I kind of was left looking at my 4Runner and thinking, I can't wait until they do this to the 4Runner. So before we dive into what the next generation of 4Runner Prime could look like, let's cover what the 4Runner is. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth because there's an entire build series that we're producing with this 4Runner here, but basically what it comes down to is it's got a 4-liter naturally aspirated V6 from the Stone Age. We got a 5-speed automatic transmission, again from the Jurassic period, and it's classic body on frame. All of this basically results in something that we hail above all else, and that's reliability. And reliability in terms of the old school nature of something like my 4Runner, which basically hasn't been touched since 2009, is it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of technology, refinement, and fuel economy. However, there's a new generation of ladder frame vehicles coming in from Toyota. It's going to be debuted later this year with the new Tundra, and for this new generation, they're pretty much doing away with natural aspiration, and that's evident by the base engine in the upcoming Tundra. It's a 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6. We also know that there's going to be normal hybrids and a full EV later in the life cycle. So it's absolutely moving that way, and while they haven't explicitly mentioned there's going to be a PHEV version for it, I would be shocked if there wasn't. So with that, that's the direction that they're going with powertrains. Which got me thinking about, okay, well, what are the pros and cons of this move toward electrification for this next generation of body-on-frame vehicles and off-roaders from Toyota, starting with, well, my 4Runner. The first thing that we have to take into account is the frame itself. The new TNGA-F architecture that's being debuted in the 4Runner and has already debuted internationally for the new Series 300 Land Cruiser, well, we can't say explicitly what it's going to result in, but we do know in terms of the Land Cruiser, it shaved 400 pounds off by just moving to that architecture. Now, cars generally and trucks are getting more heavy because they're getting stuffed with more technology, more luxury, more features and amenities. So to drop 400 pounds from the outgoing version is pretty impressive. And it also increases the strength and rigidity as well. And while the new TNGA-F architecture has been rumored and there's been conflicting information on this, but there's basically not going to be a V8 that fits within that frame. But we do know that the fact that the chassis has been reinforced, it's stronger, it's lighter somehow, and it's basically meant for this added electrification. And then the second thing we have to take a look at is driveline, and starting with the engine. Now, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that they put the same powertrain in terms of engine in the 4Runner that they did to the RAV4, which means that the motor itself, the combustion engine, is a naturally aspirated 2.5-liter 4-cylinder. Naturally aspirated means less strain on the internals. There's not turbos pushing a bunch of air and forcing a bunch of added strain onto the internals, so that reliability that we're so fond of stays intact. The flip side of that is you're adding a lot of complexity, not just in terms of a normal hybrid system, but you're also adding an 18.1 kilowatt-hour battery pack. This is where that plug-in hybrid comes in. This is where that, bigger battery, that ability to drive in full EV mode for 42 miles in terms of the RAV4 comes into play. In the 4Runner, sure, okay. You're gonna get less range because it's a bigger, heavier, less aerodynamic vehicle, blah, blah, blah. That makes sense, that's fine. But the simple fact of the matter is that 18.1 kilowatt-hour battery pack gets that RAV4 to 42 fully electric miles. Maybe they beef it up to try to stay in that 40-mile range. That's great for people getting to and from work generally. For most people, it comes down to power. Now, one of the big concerns with people dropping cylinders, and I saw this with the Mercedes GLE when it went from a V6 to a turbo 4-banger, people were so concerned about the fact that, oh, well, it's got 2 less cylinders, it's gonna be less, stout, it's gonna be less powerful. It's just not the case, because the 4Runner here makes 270 horsepower and 278 pound-feet of torque from that 4-liter naturally aspirated V6. We're talking about adding an electrification or electrified system. So we're talking about adding combined figures. So yes, that 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, that gas engine, is not going to produce the same amount of power as the 4-liter V6. But you also have that battery pack and those 2 electric motors. So you have a combined figure of 308 horsepower. So you have almost 40 more horsepower. And the torque figure is almost impossible to do the math on, but it's absolutely more than that 278 pound-feet that we're getting here. So it's going to be more efficient, fully electric range, and it's going to have a lot more power. And that's well, we'll get into the refinement of it later, but it's going to feel a lot more refined. And then second, in terms of driveline, we have to talk about transmission. Now, in that RAV4 Prime, we have a CVT, and that's not uncommon to see there, but historically, in years past, the CVT has not been a fantastic off-road transmission. Now, I can only speak to Subaru because they're the only ones that I know that really use CVT for off-road duty, or at least light off-roading, but they've made great strides in terms of keeping the transmission cool, and when you get down to the actual science of it, it kind of makes sense because you don't have, one gear that you're slipping in and out. It's just one continuous kind of band, so you can always kind of be in that peak power band. And the fact that you have that electric motor on that front and rear axle means that you have peak torque pretty much whenever you want it. So the difference here, okay, so here's the thing. The CVT makes sense in like the best off-roaders, quote unquote, your ATVs and your UTVs. They use CVT transmissions. The big difference there is that those transmissions are belt driven rather than in cars, in like things like the Subaru, it's chain driven. So those belt driven CVTs in those ATVs are meant to brake if there's an excessive load, and they're meant to be fixed and be easily accessible on the trail. Not the case with something like a crossover, a truck, or a car. They're not meant to be that way. If you break a train and if you break a chain in your CVT in a car, that's going to be a full trans out, maybe even an engine out 100% of the time. That's a much more involved and much more expensive repair. So the only other thing that I could see them doing is bringing in that 10-speed from that new Tundra. We've seen it in the Land Cruiser. We're going to get it in the Tundra. 10-speed automatic, normal torque converted gearbox. It will be fine either way. And then the third thing in terms of driveline and that we have to talk about is distribution and how that power gets to the wheels. Now, in the RAV4 Prime, it's an all-wheel drive system, which basically means this. There's 2 electric motors and then there's that one engine. So the engine power, that gas engine power, goes to just the front axle. And there's also an electric motor on the front axle that gets power. And then there's also an electric motor on the rear axle. So like right there from the bat, you've got like 70% or 75% of your power and your torque going to your front axle, and then the back axle just gets like a little bit if it starts to step out. Obviously that's not gonna work. And the simple fact of the matter is with that system, it's not mechanically linked in any way. So it's an all-wheel drive, which means that there's basically just an electronic motor on that rear axle controlling your torque, and the computer tells it when it needs to kick in. So that wouldn't work for a normal 4x4 system. The simple fact of it, it just won't. The whole glory of the 4x4 system is it sends equal power front and rear, and then you can adjust based on your locking diff and your A-track, and we'll get into that, but you can adjust your torque from there, but it needs to start with a 50-50 split. So I don't know how they would do it. The engineering is beyond me, but if anyone can figure it out, it's Toyota. But I don't doubt the fact that electric motors would make sense because you have all of that torque, and if you're having a computerized system telling you which wheel is slipping, which wheel is not, you can do a lot of finessing and a lot of like really detailed data dumping to really refine something like an A-track system or like a multi-terrain select system when you want to control really, really little slip for rock crawling and then a lot more slip for something like a sand or mud mode. I think that's where the refinement and that's where the benefit starts to come in with that computerization. You lose a little bit of that mechanical reliability that you're used to and that Toyota purists are so hard on, but at the same time, you're adding a lot more complexity and a lot more robustness to that system. So it could, in theory, become a lot more capable than it already is. And then moving on from driveline, the third thing I want to talk about is technology. And this, like I said at the beginning of the video, this is really kind of the Achilles heel of the existing and outgoing generation of Toyota off-roaders. They're old, they're reliable, they're tried and true. That's kind of what we love about them. But the simple fact of the matter is, I'd love to have a little bit more technology. But at the same time, when it comes to the actual off-road practicality and the capability and usability, Toyota's got a pretty good system, sure. While the bones are old, while the 4-liter V6 is old, the 5-speed trans is old, their multi-terrain select system is fantastic. Their A-track system is really good. You've got your locking diff, and you've got crawl control, and all of these things that have added a little bit more complexity, a little bit more refinement to the vehicle. So when you shift into 4 low, traction control is typically disabled. So you can enable A-track that use that individual wheel braking to make sure that you're not just throwing torque at, you know, one wheel and spinning it unnecessarily. You've got that braking. The multi-terrain select will allow for that slip that we talked about. If you're in the rock crawl mode in 4 low, it will allow a lot less slip than in something like a sand or mud mode. And then of course you've got your crawl control, and that's all fine and good as well. But again, that added computerization, that electric torque, that electronic motor driving out to each individual wheel or axle, the computer could do a lot of that determining for you on the fly without having, you know, maybe you're in the wrong mode, or maybe you're in rock crawl mode and then all of a sudden you don't get enough slip when you're in some sand and then you're stuck. You need something like a traction board to get out. So there's a lot more room for finesse and just a little bit smarter system. And then the fourth and final thing I want to talk about is basically refinement. Now, the main competitor of something like this, believe it or not, is the Jeep Wrangler. And due to the fact that it has independent front suspension and it has doors and a roof that stay on, it's inherently more refined than something like the Wrangler, but there is always room for improvement. The engine is not fast. The exhaust tone is coarse. The ride is, well, depending on whether or not you have KDSS, it's a little floppy. So there's always room for refinement, improvements. Like this thing is not a Mercedes by any means. So I guess the thing that gets added in terms of the electrification. Okay, so first of all, the only real difference that I think would be made outside of the adding of electric power is having an air suspension, you know, and that would be able to, again, using computers, determine, you know, how much travel or how much, you know, tolerance you're gonna, you know, allow for your suspension to handle. And then of course, you have to take into account reliability. If you puncture, you know, an air spring on the trail, then that's really, really bad, but you know, I digress. What we're talking about here is in terms of electrification and a plug-in hybrid and that electric. The main thing that I'm thinking of is in terms of day-to-day. When you're really off-road and you're sending it and like you're really far off on the trail, you probably, like I said, there's those individual scenarios where electric power might help you, but from a day-to-day perspective, if you're gonna daily drive your rig, EVs are just better. Like they just are. The power comes on instantaneously. It feels a lot quicker than this thing. It's quieter, so you don't have that commercial van humming from the exhaust. I mean, like I like to have my back window down. That's like my favorite thing about this 4Runner, and it just sounds heinous anytime I get on the throttle. So having something that's quiet, that's quick, that's refined, really smooth, you know, day to day, that would just make a huge difference. So I think where in terms of, we're talking about pros and cons of adding a 4Runner Prime or adding electrification to something like this platform, there's a lot of pros. And there's the one con, but it's a strong con of you're adding complexity, which adds cost and could lead to less reliability. Now, like I said, if anyone's gonna figure it out, it's Toyota. And I don't think they would send something out of the manufacturing line that's not got their stamp of approval, but that's just something to think of. So in terms of whether or not I'm ready for a 4Runner Prime, I think that makes the most sense for me moving forward. I'd love a normal hybrid, that's fine, but having something with full EV potential to get to and from work every day would be a blessing. You know, I don't think that something like a 4Runner makes sense at this juncture to have as full EV, because if you are gonna go out on a trail, if you're gonna do Moab or something like that, you don't have charging stations right now. So all of a sudden you get to the end of your range, or you know, you're overlanding and you need to plug in a bunch of your stuff, you don't want to bring a Jackery or a Goal Zero with you, you're gonna suck down the juice in the range of your truck, and that's just not good. But then again, you know, the fully independent, or just, you know, the ICE engine isn't the answer either. So I think something like a normal hybrid or a plug-in hybrid would be ideal for me. But I kind of want to pose the question to you guys, like, would you rather have the old tried and true, the reliable 4-liter V6 with the 5-speed trans? Are you ready for full EV, or do you want something in the middle? Leave it down in the comments, and I'll see you next time.